All right, we're recording. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is September 2nd, and this is a meeting of the Finance Committee. What I need to do to start is to make sure all members of the committee who are here can hear and be heard, because we're conducting this meeting virtually. So I'll just call out names as I see them on the screen. Andy?
I'm here.
Kathy is here. Counselor Haneke?
Present.
Tom Porter? Okay, I did hear him say present. Okay, that's all right. And Bernie Kubiak emailed me that he will not be joining us today. We have a new member of the committee, but I haven't heard from him one way or the other. I've been sending him notices, and I haven't heard from the other two members. Athena, maybe you can show the agenda today. We always start with public comments, so I will see if there are any public comments. There are two attendees. So the agenda today, because we have a shortage in the finance department, we are not going to be looking at reserves. We don't have any new information. I did send everyone some information on updated state allocations to the town of Amherst. And then we had agreed we would be beginning reviewing of guidelines. And an initial discussion, just a discussion about commercial activities at UMass, discussing whether particularly the private dorms are potentially taxable, and I think this is a legal question. Then the other two items on the agenda is whether we want today to generate any questions, or whether people can bring them to the next meeting that we want to ask in advance of the town, of the schools, in preparation for thinking about the fall and the budget. The final item, as Bob Hegner, I see Bob can just verify that we can hear you.
Yes.
Yep, great. So as Bob suggested, we're short on the timeline in November because of all the dates. So I've suggested an additional meeting date on a Wednesday. So that's the agenda. The meaty part of it is the beginning discussion of the guidelines and something more in commercial. So unless I hear any objections, I'm going to open it up first for public comments. And these comments can be on anything in the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, and please hold your comments to no more than 3 minutes. Raise your hand if you would like to make a public comment. There are no hands up, so we will say there are no public comments today. I think everyone knows this. I sent a draft of the meeting, which was the authorization of the study of the wastewater treatment plant. Paul has provided some updated wording on the issue of cash versus bond, and Bernie nicely gave me the correct spelling of the two technical terms, and I was pretty far off on both, but it enabled me to Google them and find out what these things were. So in the revised draft, there's a sentence more on what they are. And they're pretty cool in terms of interesting. And one is cool, it heats things without burning them and turns it into gas waste. It's a good way of processing. But anyway, I've made those corrections, but I haven't heard from anyone else. And hopefully I get anything from any of you by tomorrow. So I propose that we start with a discussion of guidelines, unless anyone wants to raise anything about the updates. That they were just tables that I sent you of numbers. And I did one a time trend on Chapter 90, including the new allocation from Fair Share. And the next was straight from the cherry sheet allocations to Amherst in terms of our what's being allocated to us by the state, what assessments, and I provided, just downloaded and made a PDF, both for the town of Amherst and for the region. So that is basically background information unless anyone wants to talk about it. So I'm open to any suggestions. My suggestion if there are no questions on that, we go straight into the beginning review of guidelines. And this was suggested by Mandy, focusing not so much on the numbers, but on concepts and where we might want to consider revisions. So before we get indicators. So I'm sorry, I've got too many machines here waiting for responses. Mandy.
Well, since this was my suggestion, I'm happy to start. A couple things as I went through the guidelines, not necessarily for discussion today. Some of them could be, but for planning purposes, the things I pulled out were the not considering a Prop 2.5 override to support the budget. I think we should not eliminate that one out of hand. Let's wait until we see numbers in November. Get a better idea of what state and federal is happening maybe, and potentially have a conversation or suggest in the guidelines a conversation and decision when the next council maybe is sworn in. One of the first things they do is have a discussion on that, depending on how bad the budget is. I think is what it is. We obviously don't know now, but I wouldn't eliminate it out of hand. The equal increases, I would like to flesh out that conversation more. I'm not sure it's a finance only discussion though. One idea I had, besides going to BCG, is asking each functional area, the big functional areas, to provide an early estimate of their budget needs, not necessarily geared toward any specific percentage increase or specific level services. I know it's going to be difficult for the elementary schools in particular because the next budget is a complete change in terms of reorganization of everything. So it might be a little harder for them, but I know when we had conversations last spring, I would have liked to have, given the different timelines of the different budgets, a better idea of estimated needs across the 4 areas at the same point in time, so that we could, and I think that time would be potentially now or November, so that we in our guidelines can make a better educated guess of, should it be equal across them all, or is one area facing more dire need than another because of loss of, say, let me just make something up, loss of federal funding, whether that be Medicaid reimbursements for ambulance runs or Title I reimbursements to schools, but can we get a better idea or have a conversation of that earlier? I think we should add or talk about a goal for roads and sidewalks of total funding. This came about as I was reading the budget surpluses, what we should do with the budget surpluses. I think it would be helpful in the financial guidelines to say, hey, in FY27, we want X amount of dollars going to roads and sidewalks, whether that be within the CIP or including the Chapter 90, the fair share that came through, a potential surplus use, something like that, to give a better guidance to the managers to where our road and sidewalk funding should be overall, not necessarily just in the CIP. I'll stop there. I've got a couple of others, I think, throughout this, but those were sort of my bigger ones.
Paul, and I'm going to do Paul and then Andy, and then I also have these areas and a couple others. Paul?
Thank you. So those are good topics. I think there's a couple things that would jump into my mind right away. One is, instead of saying, what are your projections? What I would say is ask departments or whoever what, eh, there's two things at play. One is union contracts. None of our union contracts are settled for next fiscal year. So that's going to be the driver for the town in terms of our union contracts. That's in the schools as well, I believe. So until we really know what the union contracts say, that's going to be the biggest driver. But I think it's fair to ask, are there external circumstances that have impacted your budget, like loss of federal aid or new programs or new additional, whatever it is, new programs that have been implemented that would materially impact your budget in addition to the COLAs and blah, blah, blah. So I think you want what you're looking, what you'd be useful is like, what's different? What's not just you. Otherwise, we're going to get into this game of like, oh, I need more money just because I need more money. And I know if I don't ask for it now, somebody's going to ask for more. And then I need to get out there and ask for it right away. But I think like document what is actually different, that we understand everybody's going to have pain and we don't have enough money for everybody. That's one item. The second one, you talk about an override. I think that that's a wise thing to not take off the table. But I think it might be worth a conversation with the council to decide under what circumstances would you entertain an override, and to say, here's the situation. And I think to pre-think that before it becomes a pressure cooker decision, to say, well, under what circumstances would it be rational for us to look for an override, and how could we get around to supporting one? Because what often happens to elected bodies is that people want more money. They say, well, we'll ask the voters. It goes to the voters, and there's not real passion behind supporting it. Because it's like, oh, let the voters decide, and then it sort of takes it off the plate. It just might be worth a conversation about under what circumstances would you say, yes, I'm supportive of an override. Of course, you need more money. And I think identifying roads and sidewalks, if that's a high priority for the council, get it out there right now. And like that's the sooner the later, the sooner you put that out there. We know it is, but we thought it was, but the council voted differently last fall. But if you're going to approach that differently this year, that would be helpful for us.
Andy. You're muted, Andy.
Thank you. I think the override question is going to be a difficult one. And one of the things that I hope we do as a finance committee is put out additional facts for the council and the community, BCG, everyone to think about regarding an override. And I think about what I ended up researching when I was making my comments through the Amherst Current, as to thoughts about as I make the decision not to seek re-election. And override came up as a major topic. And there were a couple of reasons that I think it's worth pointing out to people. One is how dependent we are in Amherst on residential property, and the amount of property that's actually not even taxable because it's either things like conservation land or it belongs to nonprofits or the state. So there's a whole series of things there. The reality is that when I started looking into it, that because of all of the factors that are at play, and the other one being that when you pass an override in Northampton, you can share it with the commercial, but if here it falls on the residential because we are so much more dominated in percentage for residential. And so if you look at the tax rates for the state for residential property, this is the 14th highest municipality in taxation for residential. And it's kind of those factors that I think are important to put out to the council and to the BCG so that people understand that we are in a unique situation, having just passed the debt exclusion, of asking for a further increase that impacts residential, because that isn't, any override is going to fall entirely on residential, which is already in one of the highest tax situations. So, I certainly agree that we should talk about override, but I think that we should not do it without providing some background for all that are involved, to have a realistic conversation about what it means to make the ask and what it would mean for taxpayers who would make a decision. And so there was those kinds of things that I was thinking about. I think that it is important that we think about what the budget coordinating group's role in this and when they should be consulted. We know of at least one counselor who is very vocal on the subject of wanting to have the BCG involved earlier in the process. And it made me think back on the history of the budget coordinating group. And what we did with the history was that it was the opportunity to ask early on these kinds of questions in an atmosphere that you could say, explain what the topics are and actually ask questions and have a conversation about it, so that you could really get an understanding of what the unique circumstances are. And so that we might want to think about when we want to use BCG, and using BCG earlier, not just to coordinate calendar and those kinds of things, but to allow for exchange of information about needs. And the comment about roads, I think, is important, but it shouldn't be done without the context of looking back at the presentation that Jason Skeels made earlier this year, actually. And that it needs to be within the context of that information, and the fact that it would cost $3 million a year above what we were spending at the time, to just continue on with the current maintenance, and it would cost $5 million a year more to really be on a path to solving the problem. And I think those are facts that need to be out there, and we need to continue to remind people of the extent of the needs, so that people aren't fooled by it. So those are my thoughts on some of the things that were already said, and what I've been thinking about.
So absent other hands, I'm going to go next. And I think it was very useful that the comments built on each other. Two possibilities on the indicators, Paul, when we do that presentation, our tax rate compared to other areas, the percent of land, some of that could just be added, supplemented to it, so we all have it. Might be a place to be sharing it. So it's just a thought. I know you're short staff on thinking of where else to put what else to do with them. The other thought I had is I have, Mandy started with equal or not. So I think the suggestion on the request would be any areas hurt something external, including loss of federal union contracts, to get out. And so my question on that is, would we do it to the major sub-departments of the town, or would we just, Paul, to do that to you as the whole town, police, fire, DPW? Because some of the things that we learned during the budget review was the frozen expenditure budgets in places like DPW were making people reliant on vacancies to even meet, the operating side. So trying to think about how those interact. So I had two, and Mandy is suggesting adding roads as a goal, which I think is a good idea. So I had three areas that may or may not be very popular since I raised them last time. One is capital amount we allow to capital. I think we should revisit that, and I want to do that interactive with the what I started to open up in June, that we have a capital reserve and we could start spending it and we could move it over to the capital budget. So JCPC could be, or the CIP plan could have a line that said from reserves. And part of that could be allocated to DPW to pay off anticipated debt. And part of it could be to enhance roads. So we could think about enriching the capital budget to take some of the pressure off of operating. So it's with those two interacting that I'd like to have a discussion on. And I started thinking of, would we aim to deplete it in 5 years, be something specific on, we're actually trying to spend it down to use it for capital, and would most of it go for DPW is what I had suggested, to offset if we can get DPW going, the building committee, so we can actually go out and be building it. So thinking of those two interactively. We had, and this interacts then with the section we had on budget surplus, where we said, put it all in the capital budget. We didn't say, put some of it toward roads. So Mandy, this is where the roads interact with when we have it at the end of the year. So my one thought on roads is I would really like to get from the town, how much have we allocated to roads? The total budget, and I could just do 3 years. 3 years worth. I wouldn't have to go back very much, but add up the fact that we've moved some money out of surplus each year into roads. We're now at nearly $1.5 million of Chapter 90. This year anyway. I know last year it was just around $1 million, but just how much have we had? And I'm sure we have been spending all of it, but people just might not realize that we've been allocating a fair amount where it's not in the line item in JCPC, in CIP at the original. So I just thought on that. So in accounting, I was thinking of just the last 3 years. And I very much like the, override, like under what circumstances might you do it? And then as Andy said, framing it in where are we as a town? And that goes with my question, and you said you would check back. When are we going to see the increase for the school, the debt exclusion? And are we going to see that for the first time when the revised current fiscal year, when we get our revision in January? Or are we not going to see it for a while? Just on so wherever we are in number 14, Andy, there's a piece coming that for the 20 or 30 years of the school bond debt will be part of our piece. So I just think trying to get as much pull it as much together that when we're talking about it. And my only other thought, and this is not related specifically to guidelines, but I had other areas, is when we do indicators and we show how much we're spending. I shared this with Paul. The Northampton mayor has started to show total amount they're spending on schools that pulls in the amount that's in pension, that's the amount in the capital budget, to be able to show not just the operating budget side. And she did it by first showing it the normal way and then having like 3 charts at the very end that said, how much are we spending? So when we saw that 2 million of our pension is going for the non-teacher staff in the elementary school. So just have people know that. And then the charter that we're getting assessed, we're paying. So she didn't add it all up into one number. She showed a piece and every piece of it to add it up. And it increased the share of the budget substantially in Northampton by doing that. But just to say we're not, it has looked to some people like we're spending ever less on schools, but in fact, some of it is the change in the way we we're accounting for various kinds of spending. So I think those were mine. I had the question of equal or not. I want to ask the library, none of us raised this, but when the library director came, her budget actually was a little bit less than what the 4% would be. So it took some of the, to me, it took some of the ease off of what they were going to have to take out of the endowment fund. And they're going to be for a full year without a maintenance crew, without a few other functions, including utilities. I mean, and the rent is all being paid out of the grant. So yes, they're paying grant. So just asking, you know, what's the budget looking like with a few, I'm not sure there are any external on there. So those were my, and this is all off the first page of our summary, which was very nice in guidelines. It hit all the high points. So I'll stop there. Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, we ought to include in our financial indicators the anticipated increases in water and sewer rates because of the capital needs that we have for the waste treatment facility. And then I guess we're going to be borrowing the money for Centennial, or I've heard that the full cost of the Centennial isn't there in our rates yet. So I think we need to alert people to that as well, because even though there are separate pots of money, it all comes from the same pockets. So people need to understand that we're going to be we're spending more on water and wastewater and sewer because of stuff that we have to do. And then I guess my reaction to looking at the high taxes that people pay is whenever people, to me, have complained about high taxes, they've also complained about, well, the roads are in terrible shape, and some people say our schools aren't performing well. So I think we need a context of not just we need more money to keep moving the way we've been moving, but we need to improve some ways, some of the services that we're providing. And roads is one where it is a matter of throwing dollars at it. Schools, I think, is a different issue. It's partly a dollar issue. It's partly we don't know what goes on within the schools. And so I think we need to highlight that we need to improve services as well as just spend more money for the same old services that we have. Because I don't think that I think people would be more willing to approve an override if they could see that the money is we're not just going to throw more money at the same problem. We're going to improve situations so that the money is spent more wisely. And I don't know that we can do that very easily in financial indicators, but I think that's the crux to me of the problem that we have, which is yes, our taxes are high, but people think we're not spending enough money on things that they care about. And we're spending too much money on things they don't care about. So, I mean, that's just the people who've talked to me about, the financial situation. And it may, people may disagree on that. But I think we need to address that.
Mandy?
But Bob hit on one of the other comments I had in here, except he did it in the opposite way. My comment was that we need to have a fuller discussion about, in anticipating a wretched budget year, thinking about how bad it might be, a fuller discussion on what services we could advise the manager to reduce. within the manager's budget. Obviously, we can't advise schools and libraries on services to reduce, but that conversation might piggyback on a conversation about increases to the major functional areas in terms of percentages. But, you know, I agree with Bob on, we hear a lot about our taxes are too high, which makes asking for an override potentially very hard, because you're asking them to do more. But I think, and this might be somewhere where can we point to and compare services we have to towns that don't have those services and tax rates based on things like that? I imagine it would be extremely difficult to do something like that. But is there a way to somehow compare and say our taxes are high, to find a reason why our taxes are high? Is it simply because we, on a per capita basis, we actually provide a lot for our money, a lot of bang for our buck, given the financial indicators presentations that Paul normally has? We're one of the lowest spending per capita towns, I think, in the state. I think, or in the area with if I'm remembering the chart right. On a raw number, that tax rate is high, but that doesn't mean, raw numbers to me are a little iffy, because a tax rate in a town that is 75% of our tax rate, but they're for average tax rates. But their average home, single family home, is double our average single family home. Their rate in terms of yearly spending is higher than ours. So I prefer to look at, where do we stand in average tax bill, not average tax rate. And are we trying to provide more services at that average rate than other towns with that rate, such that we have a harder time maintaining the services we're providing? I'm not sure I'm wording this right. And is there a way to look at that, or put that information out there and say, for a town our size or a tax rate at our level, we're just trying to do too much with the money. And if we want to do everything we're trying to do, we actually need a higher tax rate. If we don't want the higher tax rate, then we actually should be doing less, because each of the things we do, really to do it well, needs more money. I think it piggybacks on Bob's conversation that he wants to have, but looking at it from a different lens.
I'll just, Tom.
Thanks. I'm just following up those two most recent comments. I suppose we honestly, this could be the year for the really frank conversation that we've touched on, and seems like maybe getting closer and closer to, about how much we can really afford and sustaining the town out into the future. I like the way you raised your point, Mandy, about finding a way, a basis through comparison with other towns in the Commonwealth, to try to have an objective conversation about the range and also the level of service support that we provide. In my experience, but I've just more been an observer to this, we tend to have those conversations around the school budget, certain school metrics. And I note, as you said, that we don't have as much control or influence there, but I sure hope we do have that conversation. But when it comes to town services and so forth, I totally agree. I would love to see us be able to get that discussion on the table. What is the full complement of services and level of service support that we can afford? If it's the dollar figure rather than the tax rate, I think that's a way that people can fairly assess it. And I think the other factor that we always confront is the proportion of tax, the proportion of budget that is funded from property tax as opposed to other sources that may be in a different balance in other communities. Something that we feel we can't do much about. Maybe we can do it around the edges, as we talked about trying to negotiate a tax on private dorms and so forth. But I know those conversations have been held over many years and many rounds, so that it seems like there won't be anything but incremental change to that. So I really do think, I guess I'm just agreeing, and I'm not coming up here yet with a strategy for how to force that issue, that hard discussion, if others want to have it likewise. That's my thought.
Just staying on this same thread, Tom raised, if we wanted to look outside of Amherst alone to do any kind of comparisons, my first thought is, are we trying to standardize in any way? For example, I'll just start with one: library. We allocate about $2 million to our library. We could say, what does Northampton allocate to Forbes and Forbes-related libraries? Would we, if we went they're about the same population size as we are if we count students. If we went much further, we might have to divide by number of residents. We might have to divide by something, because a really small town, if we did it just as a share of our operating budget. So Tom, you suggested, is it dollars or is it percent? So just we'd right away run into that. Then if I move away from library, if I do DPW, not every town does the enterprise funds quite the same way we do. So some of what is DPW is done by enterprise funds, by people in those funds. So do we add enterprise funds together with DPW and then the capital funds for roads? And then what, so it gets tricky pretty quickly. I guess the only one, Paul, that I can think might be easy is the finance department, because it's small, but then we're talking about the salaries we pay to people or the benefits or something. But, the big areas, so if we did our police, do we add police with CRES and talk about that total budget, or do we leave CRES in its own bucket and police? So I'm just reacting to, if we wanted to do anything like that, that wasn't just looking at within ourselves, we'd have to think through the how to do it. But I do think the way Mandy framed it is about what services we could consider reducing is a different way of saying, is the money being well spent? Are we getting what we hope for out of it? And are there areas that and that will be by far the most difficult. There's one area that people would probably go to, and we won't have broad agreement in the council on even looking at it. And we just froze 2 positions. I'm talking about CRES right now, that we froze 2 positions at CRES. And if I compare what the yield is that we're getting versus the yield of a couple other towns, it feels low, even when I adjust for people, because we don't have a lot less people working for our department than Northampton has worked their community responders. So, so how do we go about doing that, Mandy, would be one of the questions. And so it's, and then finally, it's the beginning of September. So Paul's got a finance staff that we hope is coming soon. And we're talking about making some changes in the indicator set. And ideally, we would get it the first week in November, and this would kick it all. And to me, that's the easiest way of bringing the schools and the trustees in, bringing the whole town into one presentation. So getting as much information out as possible. So, so I just thought that, we do have the 16th next week, 2 weeks from now. and we could come back to this with more concrete suggestions along these lines, how we might do it. And is this something the finance committee would try to undertake with some questions asked? So that is just my thinking on not just listing, but like who's going to do this work, and what things do we think are possible during what time frame? I'm going to lower my hand. Andy's hand went up.
Just a couple things. One is that the topic again of taxation on residential property and comparing to other communities is difficult, and it's going to take somebody with some experience of doing that or some creative thinking, because obviously property is taxed on the basis of value. Ultimately, that rate that gets compared, and then you get into, well, what are the variables in the rates of property? And so what is a median house in one community is not going to be a median priced house elsewhere. So we really do need to look at how some other comparisons have been made and see what DOR, Division of Local Services, has to give us guidance, which gets into just the general comment that I think that to the extent that we have the capability to do it because of our own work and experience in doing financial analysis for a long time, some of these things we could share as committee members if needed. But I think that it is important to get it out there and to make sure that a fair comparison is being drawn. So leave it at that.
Any other early guideline thoughts? Bob?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the general fund expenditure summary on page 72 of the budget book, and the total appropriation or the total budget is 29.5 million, which is less than 30% of the total expenditures by the town. It's very hard for me to see. I mean, I'm looking at this and saying, where can I find $1 million? Where can I find $2 million? You can't, I mean, it's not there. Unless we cut out conservation and development, that's $2 million. We could cut out that whole expenditure, but I don't think that's what we want to do as a town. So I think we need to understand where we're spending the money, and along with what Mandy said, what services are we providing? And is there anything that maybe we should say maybe we shouldn't be providing anymore? But there isn't money in the town budget, the town per se, not Amherst writ large, but the money spent by the town. There isn't enough money there to really make a dent in what we need to, fix. So I don't see how we can do it without looking at the school budget, looking at the library budget. It's basically schools that would eat up most of the rest of that, and some of it is state aid and all that. I understand that, but I mean, I think we need to understand where are the pressure points where we can even begin to start looking at where we spend our money and how we could spend it differently. I don't think just looking at the town itself will help.
Paul, I see your hand is up, but I just want to add, Bob, when you look at that, the allocation of health insurance and pension needs to somehow come back in, however crude we want to do it, so that we can see that the
I
this
agree.
sub-department, with schools, with region, you see the whole thing.
Yeah.
At least in region, they've got the whole piece, including OPEB. But Paul,
So yeah, just wanted to mention health insurance, which is the other sort of wild card that we see all of our sister communities, siblings communities grappling with in our region, who are part of the Hampshire County system. That's not unusual. We were ahead of the game, I guess, by when we in Maya is a little bit bigger player. But even at Maya level, they are seeing 4% of the Blue Cross spend has been on GLP-1 drugs. They see 40% of the population of America is obese. The market is just gigantic. And I think depending what the company's strategies are, if they want it to be covered by health insurance or not, some companies don't want it to be covered by health insurance. They want it to be over the counter. So, but that's a big piece of it in terms of whether, these double-digit increases is that one of the questions that nobody really knows is that was this year a correction or is it a trend? And they're trying to sort of dig through the data to determine if this is an ongoing double-digit increase for for years ahead, or is it just this one time thing? So those are the sort of big things on health insurance that are driving, and we're not immune to that. We have high user population. Municipal employees tend to be higher users of insurance, and we've made a promise to our employees to provide health insurance. We have to by law, but yeah.
Paul, do you know, can Maya tell us, I think you made a change that was effective as of January, that the weight loss drugs would only be done if it was a prescription linked to like diabetes, and
Yeah.
otherwise if it was just a elective. And we're in 6 months worth, or with the lag, we're probably only 4 months worth in terms of the claims. Would Maya be able to know whether that moderated what they were seeing as the surge?
Yeah, I don't think it takes effect, right? I think it takes effect January 1, this coming
Oh,
January
oh,
1.
it's this
I,
coming January,
yeah,
not.
because they're looking to have a pathway to. They just don't want to have people cut off from the
Yeah.
drug that many people find very beneficial. So they're looking at a pathway for them to get into self-funding and maybe a fund that they can support or something like that.
So we won't know that when they give you your first estimate. We'll only know it when they,
Well,
in other words, they'll give you they'll give you a projection, but yeah.
they will. So they we get that number in January, but they will have made projections based on the reduction of benefits for sure. I mean, they can count. They know exactly how much is being spent on GLP-1s. So that'll be factored in.
Any other thoughts on this? I assume we have minute takers, but the Zoom recording is useful. I find it useful, but in any case, I have pretty good notes. So I can, if there's anything that people think that we should come back to on September 16th with some concrete suggestions around any of these areas. So Andy, one of the pieces, and then Paul pointed out, on tax, that if you look at our taxes, how much is resident and how much is commercial, just pointing out the different, if we're going to do comparisons with anyone, you can get proportion. But if there are any other things, I'm happy to pull them together into an amalgamation for people to look at. If that would be useful. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I think it would be helpful. I don't know, Paul, if you can do this, or Kathy, whether we should do this as a committee. It would be helpful to take the FY26 budget and reallocate things so that we're seeing like healthcare expenditures of the non-union or the non-teaching staff in elementary schools as part of what we spend on elementary schools. In other words, could we take everything and I know it's very difficult to actually do the specifics, but you could do an average of, each employee, the average pension benefit is X, the average health insurance cost is Y, and you could factor in what we're spending by category or by department more fine tuned than what we see in the budget books. I think it would be helpful to have that, and maybe not for the next time, but maybe for the when we get into the financial indicators, if we could get a better sense of how things are divided up actually, because I know we have different budget things. I mean, for example, I don't understand why the police facility is a separate line item in our budget versus just other facilities. I mean, it's just a town facility. Anyway, but there's some weirdness in our budgets that I think are historical. But I mean, I think it would be helpful for people to be able to see the full cost of elementary schools, the full cost of the police department, etc.
So Paul's raised his hand. Bob, I just want to, because I might have misstated when I asked Melissa this, it's pension that we're carrying the non-teaching staff. So it's almost 2.4 million in our pension is for the elementary, but I believe health insurance shows up in their budgets. The budget book showed head counts, but not dollar counts. So that was, Mandy looked at the head counts and said, not that many people work for the town, you know what? So, but I'll let Paul respond, but just, it's the pension one where we have a precise number, but we don't have a way to allocate pension back to police or health insurance back to police.
Right.
We don't have a way to do that.
Well, you could do it based on head count and some
Yeah.
average, you
You
know.
could do it average.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, I think so. Why are some things in the budget every year, even though they may not make sense? Part of it is for comparison purposes. So if you suddenly make changes in the budget, then some budget goes up, the facilities might go up, and you'll say, oh, and then I think you lose a little bit of comparison, whether there's value to that or not. That's just something that people tend not to like to see changes because they like to see year to year comparisons. That's really how a lot of people make decisions. I think allocating those funds is certainly possible. We can't do that without staff. That the staff won't be really here until October to really do that work.
Right.
Andy.
Yeah, and just speaking of staff who are coming in October but are not here now, one thing that I've been thinking about several times during this conversation, starting way back, I think with whoever brought up what the mayor in Northampton is doing in trying to show the full cost of what there are, full amount that they're spending on education, is how much of the expenditures that are not in the school budget are counted in the foundation budget for the Chapter 70 formula. And so how much can we then rely on DESI figures for helping us do comparison of schools? And it again gets into subject that I had worked on and thought about as I was writing my piece for the Current, but it was also based upon what advice I'd been given from others, and that is to compare how much each community spends above the of the minimum contribution requirement. And the minimum contribution requirement is based on the foundation budget. And we are actually in Amherst fairly high if you use that measure. But the measure is only as good as its ability to uniformly include expenses that we want to have included. So it is a complicated issue, and I think Sean is capable of helping with those kinds of things. But I think we also need to understand and be sympathetic as he starts out his time. Paul has plenty of need for what he can do for the community, including just rebuilding the department that he's going to be leading So I think that we have to be realistic about what we can expect from him, not what he's capable of doing, but what he has the time and energy to do.
Right. So I'm seeing that we've spent a little short of an hour on this, and it strikes me that we have a wealth of ideas, and we can come back and revisit 2 weeks from now. And people, any follow-up thoughts? I have my notes and I reorganize them into topics with my annotated thoughts on them, so I can share them back. So are people ready to move to the next, which may be a fairly short discussion on to what extent are commercial activities on the UMass campus potentially taxable? And starting with the biggest of them, which is the new privately owned dorms that are on public land. And my one thought when I did, Bernie suggested we look around and see if anyone else is taxing them in the state of Massachusetts, and I couldn't find any examples, but I did find some legal advice that said, to the extent it might be, it would be, what is the nature of the contract that the university has with the building, and are they wholly independent, and do they own the building and are they independent of the university? So we wouldn't be taxing the land, but we would be talking the building. And I have no idea what that is. And it's probably a request for a legal opinion or going into it beyond that. I forget who emailed me. It might have been Andy. When you get to the smaller things, they're operating a hearing clinic that directly competes with audiologists in the community. And we don't tax the facility, we don't tax the revenues. They're doing it as part of an education program, the way, Worcester or someone else would run, and they do clinics out of it. So that one is probably right on the edge of being educationally. The one that a couple downtown restaurants raised to me is when UMass starts catering off campus. Does their food service become at least partially taxable? People may pay a sales tax, but what about the property tax on the building, when they actually start delivering meals and catering parties off campus? So those are the ones that people have flagged. In Princeton, there were things like labs and patent generating enterprises on campus that the legal group said, yeah, these are commercial. UMass has tended to move, when something gets successful, they've tended to move it to someplace else, so I don't know how much we have that. So I'm just opening this with some thoughts, and Mandy's hand is up and Andy's hand is up. And I just wanted to raise it because we are talking about where might we get revenue from. This is the only reason I'm raising it. Mandy.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I go to how much can we really compare Princeton or a Brown or a Yale to UMass Amherst, since UMass Amherst is a state entity and we're city local? And how much does that make a difference to other universities that have found or have found an ability to receive revenue from the more commercial enterprises that the universities operate? Does the status of UMass as being a state-owned enterprise conflict with that in a sense, or present additional problems to that? Because state-owned land in general, no matter what's going on it, I think tends to be exempt from municipal taxation. At the same time, looking at the P3s, I am wondering what the difference between a P3 when we, in taxing the building on the land, is versus a nonprofit that the municipality owns the land, and a housing building is built on top of it and the nonprofit pays taxes on that. There's been many instances where we've granted funding for affordable housing where we've asked, hey, what does the tax status and the property tax status end up being for those long-term leases? And I'm curious what type of um, similarities there is between that sort of arrangement and the P3 arrangement with UMass, because to me they're very similar. Um, I I would love to know more about this, particularly with things like catering of people off campus. As Kathy said, it's probably a fine line, the audiology department, the catering off campus, the offering of food services. I'm curious though, is there a sales tax paid when UMass provides Thanksgiving dinners to the community at a payment, or caters something off campus, like maybe another entity would have to pay? And I ask that because I remember the disagreement with the UMass Hotel and whether they were subject to hotel taxes for the non, and I know it's part of the pilot agreement now. And so is that something we could go with? But yeah, I think I don't know where to go, but I think we need to know a little bit more about the legal, nuances regarding how that works as compared to, say, a nonprofit that would end up paying certain taxes that maybe UMass is not for similar arrangements.
Sorry. Annie's hand is up.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised the issue, Kathy. As I said in my email, one what Mandy was talking about with the arrangement that was made with the university about the campus center hotel. Um, Ultimately, what was agreed to was that they would pay us the equivalent as a, not recognizing it as lodging tax, but as an additional increment of what the uh, community agreement is with the university for rental of rooms that are being rented to outside paying guests, as opposed to anything that's being paid by a university department to house a guest of that department. That we were not was not included in the calculation. And when that happened, it got me thinking about the question of what we're getting in meals taxes, because that is the equivalent. And I think that if you or I go to the Blue Wall or one of the dining centers and have a meal, that we are paying tax on that. But it would be nice to confirm that.
Paul confirmed it with a receipt he sent me. Sorry.
I bought a cup of coffee just out of curiosity, and they did charge me meals tax.
Yeah,
But I use my card. I use my card, and if you use your student card, then they don't get charged.
That's what I thought. So if we're paying outside, and I assume if we're paying cash, it would be the same. So there is some distinction that is being paid. I think that the big one is that's not being considered is the PPP buildings, which has already been discussed. I had made the suggestion, Kathy, that we ask Kim Mew whether she has run into this question either in her own experience or because she goes to conferences and training programs all the time that are geared towards assessors and what because that's just part of part of what she does to maintain her expertise. And so somebody, I think, needs to ask Kim, if you haven't had a chance to do that, if she has any knowledge. And of course, the other is the legal, asking KP Law whether they're aware, because this is a legal issue that must be thought about by various municipalities that KP Law provides legal services for. So I think we need to find out what are happening in other communities and what, if anything, Kim might know, or might, where she might steer us to get any information. And the other thing that, as Kathy said, I am very skeptical about the hearing aid program, simply because it is run as a teaching clinic for the School of Public Health and Health Sciences. They have a Center for Language, Speech, and Hearing Services and award degrees, both undergraduate and graduate degrees. And so they maintain that program to do audiology testing and hearing aid assessment as part of audiology testing, is a part of an educational program, and it would put us in a position of saying that we're taxing something that would be, in my mind, equivalent to a medical school, whether it be a public or a private medical school, or a hospital for that matter, that is providing services. I don't think that that makes the physical property taxable, even though they are, as a part of their services, charging people for receiving services. So I am, I'm not opposed to looking at, but I'm very skeptical.
So, Paul, I don't know whether Kim will know much about this. I did Wisconsin, Mandy, on your, should we look for something that's a public? They do have some privately built dorms on their campus. So we might have to look outside Massachusetts if you want to look public university and building, as opposed to BU and some of the others that have done this, that we know exist. And as I said, when I did a quick search, the legal opinion came back as it depended on what the nature of the contract was, on ownership of the building and how independent it was to set the rents, to run it, to, long-term leasing, on was it completely a private entity, or was it still part of the university? So these are questions that we certainly can't answer, but I have actually been asked this by several residents. And some of you may remember when we ran for council, one of the questions that was put out was, is PPP potentially a win-win-win situation? We get more dorms, the town gets property tax revenues, and the state gets someone else to build it rather than put it under its own debt structure. And that quickly went away as an idea because we didn't have an example of it at that point. Now we have an example. So that's the main reason I've raised it. I've had a couple people from the finance department at UMass ask me this question. My only answer is I can try to find out. So Andy, I'm taking hearing aids completely off the list. When we get to food services, there's a full-scale restaurant that's run in the one food hall that is a real restaurant, and they may pay a sales tax when we eat there, but it's competing with downtown businesses. What it was the hearing aid. So forget hearing aid, but just these other direct competitors where you can choose to go eat at night at UMass and have a meal with a candle on the table, or you can go downtown somewhere. So that's the reason I raised it, just on the revenue side. Andy.
Yeah, and of course, then you are having to make a distinction at some point, because we're not talking about just the meals tax. We're talking about
That's right.
a property tax for
I'm
some
talking about the property
building,
tax.
and how you would make that calculation and whether you can make that calculation, um, because it may not be a large portion of the building. But the one thing I wanted the reason I raised my hand was that when the question came up of building the dorms that now exist over on that side of campus, it's something I asked Nancy Buffon as to what it is that the university is doing as far as, is it having a role in running the residence halls or administering? Is it part of housing services, or is it totally independent rentals? And the answer was it was totally independent rentals, and that the housing services plays no part in administering or allocating space in those buildings. It is entirely a private enterprise.
So other than requesting Paul to get us a legal opinion or requesting Paul to have Kim look at it, I'm not sure how much further we can take this. Would people agree with that? I mean, we have questions without answers. Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, I agree, but the question I have is how much money are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about $50,000? Are we talking about $500,000? I mean, if it's only $10,000, it's probably not worth fighting for.
That's why I think the dorms are they're not dorms, they're apartment buildings.
No.
They're big enough that I think Kim would assess them, the building part, similar in terms of the rents that are being charged, and the rents are really high.
Mhm.
So these are big enough to count as our new growth numbers that we're so excited about every time we get them.
Okay, I mean, I just wanted to make sure that we're not chasing.
That's the one. The others are nickel and dime level.
Yeah.
But these house enough in apartments that I forget if I added up the rooms, if they're like one of the big downtown buildings in terms of the number of units in them or not. But they're two big buildings there. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people like to call the apartment buildings downtown dorms, and they like to call the dorms on campus apartment buildings. So these are definitely dorms that are served exclusively for the university. I don't believe that you and I could go and rent them. I think that's a difference maker. Whereas the buildings downtown, you and I could rent them if we chose to, as could students. But I think you're talking big numbers, Bob. We're hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential tax revenue and I think you're right to say these are to be going after the nickel and dime stuff, like Kathy said, doesn't make a lot of sense. Our previous assessor did go into every facility in the blue wall that was available to the public and did the personal property assessments and things like that. We do pay attention to those kinds of personal properties that are subject to taxation. But I think the big question, I'm sure that the financial structure for these was built on a not paying property tax basis. I doubt they have a pro forma that shows property taxes, and that's probably how they borrowed the money as well. But it will become a litigious thing with the university. University will probably not get a bill and say, "Oh, here you go, here's your check." But we can certainly look into that and get it. We have had that conversation with KP Law in a peripheral way, just in a sort of what do you think? And it's more looking at the most likely comparison is the UMass Boston dorm that was built as a PPP, the first one that was approved by the governor. These require state gubernatorial approval actually for this level. And I don't believe, I was just trying to look, I don't know, like we'd have to check with the Boston assessors. I don't think they pay taxes, but I'm not positive about that. And I don't know if it's owned by a for-profit or a nonprofit organization also. But the underlying land is owned by the university.
No, in this case, Paul, that I agree, it's only students living there, but they don't even set the rates, the rental rates. So the private developer that built it set them high enough that they ended up with vacancies. You know, they seem to have a little bit misjudged the market. That might not be true this, you know, with it reopening, but there were still some vacancies. So I think we could leave it with, if you could tell us whatever other exploration we could do. I was looking for big dollars, not little dollars. Mandy. And
Yep.
I think the developer would pay the money. I mean, the building owner, not UMass, you know, so the state, they would object to it because it's not built into their rent calculation and what they're charging. But yeah, I didn't think UMass would have to pay the tax. Mandy.
Just for comparison on an assessment, Olympia Drive, the dorm on Olympia Drive, is assessed at 18 point almost $5 million. I can't download the property card. It says only available at town hall, so I can't see what their tax is. But if their tax, if they're paying, if the tax is based on that assessment and not the revenues, that's quite a large number at, you know, $18 per thousand, right? So
That's fine.
If you know their address, Mandy, you can go into their tax bill thing. You can go in a different way to find it. But yeah, that's
I pulled up the GIS, and for some reason, normally all the property cards are normally there, and for some reason it's not. I don't know whether it's because it's a commercial building, you know, a multifamily, that it doesn't have a property card available.
so Andy.
Yeah, no, another question then. I'm glad you brought up the Olympia Drive buildings. Is that land? Who owns that land? That they
Privately owned.
It's listed as privately owned LLC.
Okay.
There's a fraternity that sold the land to the developer.
So I think that ends this conversation, unless there are any other thoughts on it. The other one was adding a date to our calendar. And Elisha just emailed me that not only is she not coming today, but she will never be coming at 2:00 because she has a class at 2. So we can confront that when we meet again in 2 weeks. But I suggested adding, I think it was November 12th, it's a Wednesday, where to our finance calendar. And I didn't know whether when I was looking at the various dates, that would mean we're meeting the 12th and the 18th of November. The 18th is our normal Tuesday, but we were hitting Thanksgiving, Veterans Day, and the election, which is why there's only one November date. So we had to move off of a Tuesday. And so I just picked a Wednesday that was before that. So I don't know what, I mean, we don't have to make a decision right now, but my proposed was that date at our regular time, unless we don't conflict with any other council committees on Wednesday. So I also was trying to avoid Thursday, which is CRC. And it doesn't have to be 2, it could be 4. It doesn't have to be the same time. Does that day generally work on people's calendars?
It would be fine for me. I think we need to pull our missing members, the new
Yep.
member.
Yeah,
And
no,
Alicia.
I will before I make it official. And we have this unofficial, the calendar was somehow never, even though we made it official, it was never posted, but we do have a calendar. So I will put it in tentatively, and it was on the agenda. So I will ask Jane, who our new member has not come either time. So I hope, I don't know whether maybe that was issue, Paul, that he hasn't been confirmed with, you know, go through the screening process, but Jane, we haven't, so far hasn't come, but I will email him. And Alicia, maybe Wednesdays are fine with her at 2 p.m. as tentative. And then the other one was a placeholder. And again, this could be for discussion on the 16th. Questions, and Mandy, you kind of jumped into it by saying, do we want to send some questions out to the schools, to the town, about the coming budget, on unexpected things, on union contracts. So I didn't know whether there's any other information. We had already said we'd like to know when the schools will close the year, we'll know for sure what they spent in the most recent year. And I can work on I can get that information, or Paul can get that information for us, just on when will we know what the actual year was, before it's the current year. So any other questions that people conceive of, we can talk about them on the 16th. And then we can send them out. And I will do a draft of what we just discussed for people to review. Those are the two items I have. Any areas hurt by external actions, such as a loss of federal funds or a new program. And the second was union contracts, trying to narrow it on what people are seeing. Anything else for today? Well, thank you all very much. And as Paul said, he said, not only do we not have a finance director, we have a comptroller, but the treasurer was on vacation. So there was a, for today, short staff was an understatement.
And the principal assessor's on maternity leave.
Okay.
And our assistant treasurer just became the treasurer of East Hampton.
So there we go. So short staff was definitely an understatement.
But we're in good shape. We're moving forward.
Well, welcome to September, everyone. Tom saw me downtown over the weekend. He says, now we're really going to be now we start moving into the more intense phase, but we're going to move in a little bit slowly. So that's good for all of us, I think. So I will see you in 2 weeks. And again, send me
I need a
anything.
motion to adjourn, and
I need to
I
do
move.
that.
I so move.
I second it. And I will go around for a vote. Andy?
Yes.
Kathy's a yes. Mandy?
Aye.
Bob?
Yes.
Tom?
I concur.
Thank
Yes.
you all. Thank you all for jumping in. It was I thought, a very good discussion. And see you in 2 weeks.